Hello and welcome all to our podcast, The Business of Travel. I'm your host, Annette Cumming, and we are all here as part of the GBTA Accommodations Committee, and we're super excited to bring you a session on, I would say, one of the most popular topics within the GBTA community, which is hotel RFPs. Now, today, our perspective is not only going to be looking at a look back and what the data tells us, but we're also going to look at the big picture for hotel sourcing now and in the future. We have a lot to cover, so let's jump in. And I am thrilled to be joined by my colleagues, David and Fred, who are also on the Accommodations Committee. And I'm going to have them introduce themselves. So David, if you could go first.
Sure. Thank you, Annette. So I work for a company called Emburse. We do expense management, but also a lot of travel products to help travel managers optimize and better understand the cost of travel. And my background is both on the technology side, but also the hotel supplier side. And so having worked a lot with hotel RFPs over the several decades, I'll say couple decades, I've certainly got a lot of experience in talking about this topic.
Wonderful. Thanks, David. And Fred.
Hey, thank you. Yeah, my name is Fred Veliyev. I work for Cvent Transient, and Cvent has, event side as well as transient side applications. So I'm focused on the RFP transient publisher app. And previously I worked for Sabre Hospitality Solutions, so maybe about a decade of hospitality tech experience.
Fantastic. We have the right people on this podcast. I'm so excited to learn from both of you. So my name is Annette Cumming. I'm the Senior Vice President of Business Development at CerebriAI. I've spent the last 38 years across nearly every facet of the travel industry. And I'm excited to bring my perspective, but also really learning from our panelists today and your experiences across hotel sourcing. So, we're not doing this at GBTA live, but this is the next best option, I think. And so people can hear this on repeat. This is always a really popular topic. But before we jump in and cover the data part of it, let's see what people are saying. So we recently posted a survey on LinkedIn through our committee. What matters most to you in your decision today? So negotiated rates, honestly, no surprise there, but 33% said it's a combination of negotiated rates and amenities, which is interesting. And then traveler experience at 25%. So that's interesting. And when we get outside of the data, I want to talk a little bit more about that traveler experience, because I don't think that's always something people associate with hotel sourcing, but it absolutely is, thinking about the hotel experience when you're on your business trip and how sourcing can impact that. So really, really interesting numbers there. But we're going to start with a rewind. And this, when this session is done at convention, I think this is the most popular piece of that, because people love to see the data numbers. And Fred and David are going to share that with us today. So let's go ahead and start that with you, David, and give us a recap of what 2026 looked like.
Thank you, Annette. So what we've got available to you is booking level data. And so this is kind of the output of what happens after the sourcing process. Well, our source of information is information that comes into our environment globally across a couple thousand customers. We have a concentration of customers in the BTN 100. And so we are talking about all managed travel programs. We are talking about corporate travel. We are not talking about leisure. And what we bring into our environment is the booking, and we also bring into the retail price at the time of the booking. And so, as retail prices certainly do go up and go down, what we have, which is unique for you, is that actual retail price at the time that the traveler made those reservations. And what stands out for us, because we've been doing this for a number of years and putting this thing out certainly since the pandemic, is the discount off of retail is usually always about the same, doesn't change much. And what this says to me is your corporate negotiated deals, or what corporate negotiated programs are and what travelers are paying, is usually about 20% off of the retail price. And so as people negotiate their discounts and try to look to optimize the increases, usually the increases that the travelers or the corporate travel programs are paying is usually in lockstep with what happens on the retail side. Obviously, you don't know what the retail prices are going to be in the next year because it really has to do with demand generation, but we always find that it is the same and it doesn't change much. We'll come back to that 20% in a slide or two, but it's a pretty interesting trend that it just hasn't changed, which brings me kind of the next slide, Annette, which is what do patterns look like? Well, this is a picture of booking data from 2019 all the way to the present. And, obviously, we've done this over and over again over the years. What happened in 2019 fell off a cliff in 2020 and has slowly been building itself back up from 21 to 22. But from 23, 24, 25, and even into 26, these patterns are following the exact same way. What I'm getting out of this, though, is that these patterns are still smaller than what happened in 2019. And, with the fact that 2019 is actually, more than 5 years ago at this point, I think the paradigm has shifted, and it has shifted permanently. So, the back to work initiatives, the remote hybrid initiatives, the Zoom call initiatives, those are now a permanent part of what it is that we do, and those have already impacted travel patterns. So whatever we were doing back before the pandemic, that's in the history books, and that's for us to study for another time. At this point, it looks like we're pretty consistent as what's going on. So when we start talking about from year to year, we're now talking about the new world. Next slide.
David, quick question before we go on to the
Sure.
next one. Do you find customers still maybe even verbally making comparisons to pre-pandemic, or do you think that talk track is over?
I think it's over from the buyer perspective. What I have heard, though, are questions every now and then from the investment community as to what's going on with that. And the reason why I think they're looking at that is valuations of properties. Corporate travel has always been an attractive segment for hotels because less price sensitivity, a lot of last minute bookings, a lot of higher prices, and usually the travelers use other parts of the hotel as well that some of the leisure travelers didn't historically. And so with that being less of a proportion of the total spend at a hotel, that certainly has implications for profitability and growth and that kind of thing. I think what we have seen, with some of that leisure stuff out there, there's some other indications of what's going on. And certainly leisure has been a much larger driver at properties. But it's the investment community that's interested in corporate travel from 2019. The rest of us have kind of moved on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense.
So this is that chart I was talking about with that 20%, consistent. The green line represents the average market rate. So that's the price that is available to the retail market at the time that the corporate travelers book. And the purple line is what's actually booked. Now, what's important to note here, what's actually booked isn't necessarily the negotiated rate all the time, and I've got a slide for that in one or two. But in the meantime, when you look at what people are actually paying over the course of time, that green line and purple line are very close to each other. Obviously, they go up and down with seasonality, but I drew those two orange lines, and I didn't really have to modify them at all. I literally copied one and dropped it down to the other, and that's exactly what it is. And so, I think the implication to the buyer is, as you're thinking about, what do you want to negotiate into the next season, listen to what hotels are talking about in terms of forward numbers for retail, and that should be how you think about your increases for corporate. The other thing to keep in mind is the segmentation. So, to what extent am I paying flat rates versus dynamic rates versus other rates, right? And so where a buyer can certainly improve their performance relative to the marketplace has to do with what can they do to get a deal better than 20%, because that is essentially kind of the benchmark of what you're going to see across the market. Next slide.
Yeah, so quick observation. I'm really glad the purple line isn't above the green line, right? Because that wouldn't be good either if from a trending perspective. It's interesting as things started to dip off with the pandemic, that things blurred a little bit, but this is really interesting data.
I had a quick question.
I mean, listen, that actually, if you want to go back, that represents across all customers. But the thing is, as a customer, you want to look at your performance, and you can look at this down to particular properties, particular areas, and particular cities. Because to your point, yes, it's great that the purple line's below the green line, but it isn't always, right? These averages tell a different story than what happens in Omaha, Nebraska versus London, England.
Fred, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was curious, David, if you know how this 20% benchmark, happened. Is this a benchmark that TMC sort of set on themselves, or properties are basically allowing for this, and that has been just consistent over the years?
I think so if you think about when the decisions are made, right? Corporate travel rates are usually decided upon about a year in advance, or 9 to 12 months in advance, based on the RFP season when things are loaded, right? And in a flat rate world, it's much more defined than obviously a dynamic rate world. We'll get into proportion of total in a slide or two, but what's interesting is, so if that's the price, right, that's, I think, how the properties lay the base in terms of what they expect to see over the course of the year. So when they start setting the retail prices are usually above that, right? And so they probably set targets of about 20 to 25%, probably a little higher than that too. But what ends up happening is, if the property can't actually achieve the retail prices they're looking for, they have to discount down to fill the properties closer to arrival. And so I think what's happening, you'd think they'd be like, one's got something to do with the other. They do appear to be different conversations based on what happens in execution. However, the number always ends up coming out to be about the same, about 20 to 21% from year to year to year to year.
Yeah, great observation.
So what this slide has to do with is the volatility, right? And the other thing, what this has to do with is the difference between bookings that have offers relative to all bookings. And so what we mean by this is, we only find offers for hotels or for travelers to get better deals when those prices change. And the volatility, the blue line that keeps going up and down like a heartbeat, that has to do with are rates changing? Now, I could have changed the scale so it makes that a little more jagged. But if you look at the purple line, which is the smoothing 30-day, the average line, it's still around 15%. Now, it gets a little higher than 15% further out, a little closer to 14% closer in. But we really are talking about very small changes in numbers. And what this says to me is, while there certainly has been a lot of innovation in the marketplace, and certainly in revenue management models for properties, the concept of pricing remains the same at hotels. They start with what they want to get. They start with what is out there in the marketplace, and they certainly adjust those prices as you get closer to. And so as those prices continue to change, those blue lines jag it up and down. And so ultimately, that says to me, there will always be a place for reshop in a program, whether you use our technology or other technologies, because hotels have not changed the way that they price. All right. This is the last slide. I was kind of hinting at this a couple slides ago, which has to do with what is the proportion of business that is being booked across rate types. The big line at the top, the gray line, is the flat static rate, and that is clearly still the dominant way that most travelers are paying. The black line is the chain-wide rate. And so interestingly enough, that is the second most popular rate that's being booked. However, it's obviously a lot smaller relative to the gray line. The next line, interestingly enough, is the public rate line. And so this is where a traveler is making a reservation at a hotel where they don't have a chain-wide agreement, or that chain-wide agreement is not available to book, and they don't have a negotiated rate. It's almost as high as the chain-wide, which is very interesting. The green line is the dynamic line, which is a lot closer to the zero line, along with all the other rates that travelers are paying. And so one thing to keep in mind is, as you're negotiating your program, obviously a lot of focus is usually on the negotiated rates, the flat rates, the dynamic discounts, right? But it's important to understand that your travelers aren't just booking your flat rates or your dynamic discounts. They're also booking places where you have preferred deals and they're not actually being seen. And you're booking at hotels where you don't have deals. And so the idea here is, as you think about this, when you put all of these prices together, this comes out to that 20% discount off of retail. So as a rule of thumb, if you're negotiating a dynamic discount, you want to think about 20% as your marketplace for where you're looking for. Now, I know that that's something that is controversial among the supplier community, but if you're looking for what is parity with what's out there, certainly if the chain wide represents the second largest component or share of rates booked, if you want to get more dynamic discounts in your program, it has to be competitive because the gray line represents 20% off, and that is most of what is being spent.
This is really interesting. What's the difference between consortia and agency on this?
Consortia is kind of those rates that appear across agencies. So like a Radius or oh gosh, I forget the name of the other companies that do these kinds of things. They like when you have agencies that are affiliated with networks, those are the consortia rates, whereas the
Sure.
agency rates are the ones that are actually booked by the agency, like a GBT preferred extras rate or a BCD specific rate. Only BCD or only GBT can sell those rates. Any affiliated agency with Radius can book the Radius rate.
This is really so. Can you assume that the flat static is booked in channel, like through an agency for both that and dynamic? So the light gray and the green are, yeah, it has to be. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
But this actually, a lot of this is, let me back up. This is all in channel. This is all through the agency because we don't know what doesn't come through the agency because that is the source of information in a lot of cases. So while we do get some direct feeds from other places, the largest share of our revenue, or sorry, a largest share of our data comes from in-channel bookings.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. That makes sense. Fred, do you have any questions for David on this? It's really interesting.
Yeah, very insightful. I was just curious which one of these are, typically fixed and dynamic. So I'm assuming like agency and consortia, they're probably all dynamic. Is that correct?
Everything is dynamic except for fixed, right? So like retail prices come up and going and down. Chain-wise are discounts off of retail, right? Consortia rates are usually consortia and agencies are usually following retail, so they go up and down. The government rate is obviously the per diem is set, it's a very small proportion of total in terms of what there. So that's probably more fixed, but loyalty certainly comes up and goes down with retail as OTA.
Mm-hmm.
And is this by usage or by the rates themselves going up and down on the graph?
This is by usage, right? So what you'll see is, in December it falls because that's when the patterns start to, come down for the year, and then starts to spike back up again in January. Mm-hmm. And so with a little bit of a dip in the middle of the summer.
Yeah, really interesting. Well, I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit more about, just rates and measuring your program, but this is really insightful. And I'm sure our audience will think that as well.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, what's always fun about this conversation between Cvent data and Emburse data is Cvent data is what everybody thinks is going to happen, right? And that's where all the attention is in terms of what the work is, right? That's where the work is. This is what actually happens, right? And I think what ends up happening is as you think about what you want to do next, think about what just happened so you can figure out how you want to plan for what you want to have happen.
Right. It's super helpful. If I were a buyer, I would definitely look at some of this data just from a trending perspective as well. It's really helpful. Great, thank you. All right, now let's shift to Fred, and Fred is going to go through some statistics from the Cvent point of view.
Yeah, thank you. So we'll review data that is for 2026 and a few prior contract periods for programs sourced within the Cvent transient system. So what we are seeing is that the program flexibility has kind of remained the same over the past few years. So they are mostly allowing fixed and dynamic rates for most of the programs, about 90%, and about 10% limited to just fixed and almost zero limited to just dynamic. And that has remained approximately the same for 3 years.
I am shocked at that fixed only. I'm not going to lie. You might have something on the combination of the fixed and dynamic. But yeah, that's a really interesting statistic. I did not think it would be that low for fixed only.
You're right, because especially if we go to the next slide, we'll kind of see a flip of this, which is that, for last several years, in terms of accepted bids, nearly 90%, 85, 86% have been fixed, about 14% has been dynamic. So although programs allow for both, the acceptance rate is predominantly for fixed because buyers just, prefer predictability and certainty for markets and relationships that they care most about.
Interesting to see the trend for 2026 on dynamic come down. You're talking about some of the pressures of dynamic rates in the market. Yeah, that's interesting to see it come down overall.
Well, it's interesting. So there was a period of time, and this goes back into I think 22, 23, when things were starting to recover, when some customers were playing around with just going all dynamic, right? Hey, what if I just agree to 16% or 22% or 38% or whatever, and this auto renew it, right? And because the idea was, hey, if it's 20% and it's always going to be 20%, if you raise your prices by 5%, it'll be 5% minus 20%, what we found is the supplier community was not interested in maintaining those kinds of things and wanted to negotiate year after year. And so, while there's obviously a supplier bent towards more dynamic, I think to Fred's point, that's not what a lot of the buyers end up accepting. And I think it's because, if we're going to negotiate year after year, we may as well negotiate off of something I can negotiate off of, right?
Right. And it seems like budgeting is another factor for buyers. Like they want that price certainty for the year. So that might be another factor. But I think, as you previously mentioned, that sometimes the dynamic discount isn't sufficient compared to some of the fixed rates that they're able to achieve. So,
yeah, I don't see this going away anytime soon.
Yeah, despite the tension and yeah.
You're right. We're all
Yeah.
going to keep talking about it. And at the end of the day, it's both sides just have to come together and figure something out that's going to work for everyone. And I know for our accommodations committee, this is a topic we talk about a lot. And I don't think there is a perfect answer. But the data helps. It helps all of us to understand what the trends are and the pros and cons of both.
So this next slide is a further breakout of, again, accepted bids for 2026 and a few prior periods. And it's just showing that the LRA fixed is by far the most preferred rate at nearly 70%. And then NLRA and dynamic are about equally preferred at about 15%. And that, again, has remained fairly stable over the years.
What's DYN? I haven't seen that term.
Oh, yeah.
Before.
Thanks for pointing that out. I actually forgot to mention because it is so tiny on the chart. So dynamic with ceiling makes up less than 1% of accepted bids in 2026, again, within the Cvent system. And that is actually on a slight declining trend. So it's really not very popular.
And then DYN is is that just regular dynamic?
Without the ceiling. Yep.
Ah, got it. Okay. All right.
This one's always kind of fun to see because, LRA, I think, is one that I think a lot of buyers want and expect and try to get, right? What we've found with our data set through the auditing that we do, that you may negotiate you may negotiate a flat rate LRA, but there is no commitment that you'll actually get it, right? I mean, we see that only 60 to 70% of the time are people actually able to book their flat rate LRA rate. The other noted thing that we noticed in some of the conversations with the dynamic with ceiling is the buyers want the suppliers to do the heavy lift of making sure that they don't pay more than a certain amount. And that makes absolute sense. I'll take your dynamic, but you got to promise me you're not going to get any more than X, right, in any particular date. Well, the thing that we all debate at the Accommodations Committee is, well, where does that fit into the RFP? There is no question for a dynamic with ceiling, and is dynamic LRA or NLRA, right? And so, I know that's something we're talking about in terms of what we do to the RFP as we go forward. What's interesting is this is what everybody says they want, but in execution isn't necessarily what they actually get. And so it's important to understand, if you negotiated something, are they delivering on it?
That's a huge part of it. In concept, it sounds great, right? I can go and tell my organization I know the max of what I'm going to pay, but how does that actually happen, and how do I monitor that? To your point, is a big piece. It's interesting. I didn't think it would be that small, Fred. Honestly, from a percentage. But to David's point, it's not really widely broadcast within the sourcing, I think, community and buyers, and right, because it isn't a standard within the template. Yeah,
it's important.
Right, and the buyers can always add caps if they wanted to,
because some of our supplier customers have been asking for dynamic with ceiling NLRA, and because they wanted to increase the share of bids here, but we were sharing these stats with them because we were just saying, in terms of accepted bids, it's just not worth, their effort and, obviously the rest of the industry's effort to, increase the work with this kind of a rate type. Because even with LRA dynamic with ceiling, the acceptance is tiny. Now imagine if it's NLRA, then,
Yeah.
It's even tinier, right?
Yeah. Just a quick further breakout just to see how these rates differ by region. So the biggest difference is in Latin America. So NLRA makes up 80% of accepted bids there, compared to like EMEA, where it makes up 60% of the bids. And EMEA looks like they're more flexible, or they're more comfortable with flexible rates. So NLRA makes up about 25% there, and it's the largest segment, and 16% with dynamic. So this next view is about negotiation rounds. So we know that the RFP process is very time consuming. So we always look at various ways to see where are people spending their time and how the trend goes. So we consistently track negotiation rounds, and it looks like there has been a positive declining trend in negotiation rounds in 2026 compared to 2025 and prior years. So in 2026, half the bids were completed within one negotiation round, and that's up from 40% in 2025. And approximately 90% of bids were completed within two negotiation rounds, and that's up about 5% over last year.
Fred, what would be 0 rounds? Walk us through that.
Yeah, so that is the buyer submitted the hotel's initial bid without any negotiation rounds.
Oh, so it came back and they accepted it immediately.
Yes.
Got it. Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Well, I'm happy to see things getting faster. Yeah, because everyone, it is a concern about the amount of time that this takes, but the numbers are moving in the right direction. 88% within 2 rounds is really good.
That is, and we're seeing that EMEA and direct corporations, self-service corporations, tend to have even less rounds on average, slightly less.
I think what we're seeing as it relates to why this is happening is the hotels have become less bullish on rate increases. Doesn't mean that they're not increasing their prices. They certainly are endeavoring to. But when you look at hotel supplier performance over the course of 25 and the expected performance in 26, is that RevPAR, which is the metric they use to determine, how well they're doing on the top line, is flat to low, right? And obviously different segments, different parts of the country, different parts of the world have different, metrics. But going into 26, the perspective was, hey, this isn't going to be as rich as it was before. Occupancy is not growing any faster than it has. And we may be at the top of the cycle when it comes to what we can get in rate increase. And of course, with all the uncertainty in the world, with all the geopolitical stuff going on, even particularly in the US as it relates to inbound travel, I don't think that that's changed. I think there's still a lot of flatness going on in the hotel industry. And so as you think about negotiating rounds going into 26 into 27, I would lean on that as a buyer, which is to say, hey, do you want to keep messing around with this and nickeling and diming each other, or just want to put this in the books and call it a day?
Yeah, that's right. And I actually have a similar point on the next slide, a related point, which is that the buyers have also been compressing their programs, so they've been a little bit more focused and diligent about the markets that they're focused on in building relationships and pressing harder, in terms of price stability there. And like you said, David, so in terms of the accepted RFPs that we have seen in 2026, the rate increase has been 2% or less. So they have done really well in terms of achieving that price stability by, I think, focusing. And the hotels have also, like you said, their initial bids, or maybe their, the next negotiation bid has been acceptable.
Really interesting. Great data from both of you. I thank you for sharing. I mean, you are industry experts, and your organizations are really leading the discussion. And so I think our listeners are going to get a lot out of this information, because sometimes it's hard to find. It's hard to know what everyone else is doing and what the trends are, because all of our customers at some point have to talk about this within their organization, and as it's definitely going into budget season. So great information. Thank you both for that. All right, now we're to the part where we're just going to chat. We've got some topics to cover, but you've also given me some ideas around having seen your data that maybe we want to double click on. But this is going to be very casual, where we pick a couple topics in the time that we have left. So David, I'm going to start with you first. The concept is, let's make sure we're measuring what matters. And I actually am just going to, before I give you a question, as we were going through the round information, wouldn't it be incredible if we had the data point on average on the buy side and the hotel side of what it costs to in time and energy to process rounds. I think buyers inherently know the time it takes them to respond and to kick it back and all of that. But I think it'd be really enlightening if I were a buyer to know, what's my ROI to keep pushing back on this? Yeah, you can do some numbers and some math on things, but I don't think there's really a public number out there about what it takes on average for a hotel to come back with a round. I don't know if either of you have ever heard of a number, but
You're talking about on the supply side, like what's the ROI for the property?
Yeah, like so a buyer could understand, if I'm going to kick it back, yes, there's some math there. If I want $1 more a night off, for example, times my room nights, that's my savings, right? But what is it costing that hotel every time I go back to them?
Yeah, that's interesting. Right? I mean, the data is so unstructured to be able to quantify that. It would be hard to do, because most of what I think about when I think about what you're saying is the griping, right? The griping between, oh, I got to spend more time on this. And of course, on the sales marketing side, time that you spend on one activity has an opportunity cost of what you're not doing on another activity, right?
Right.
And so, you can argue that if a hotel has to respond to another round, right, then that is business, the time that they're not spending on finding new business or working with existing customers or taking care of the customers they have, right? But in terms of the technology, I think that, the providers that are out there, certainly on the supply side, have made this as easy as they possibly can with RFP teams at the corporate level in some cases, better interfaces for the property. All you really need to do is just kind of go in and bang in another number. What becomes complicated, I think, for the suppliers is the negotiation that the transient sales manager has to have with their revenue manager and their director of sales and their general manager when they sit there and have an entire another round of conversations. Should we give it to them for 14% or should we just stick it to them for 15%? Yeah. Like that's where I think that's where a lot of the conversation is, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point, Annette. And it's worth mentioning that I think buyers would probably be maybe less frustrated and kind of more satisfied with the process if they appreciated and understood all it takes on the hotel side, to respond to their RFPs for initial bid and negotiations. Because some of them maybe, in terms of a smaller chain, maybe they have it automated or they have a quicker process. But for some of the larger chains, it goes through several reviews, like there might be an initial RFP review, an admin is doing something, and then the sales director and, then the property needs to work with their regional revenue manager, like you said, and then it could go back and forth there. So you're right. I mean, I think it would be interesting to know for the property, what is that cost, and to make sure that their first most important negotiation, which is that first submission, is actually, acceptable, and, for the buyers to maybe not nickel and dime back.
Well, I mean, if you paraphrase the art of war, if you know your adversary as well as you know yourself, you'll increase your win percentage.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think this comes down to, something we talked about at convention last year for this session in person was just transparency. And I think this just feels like a data point that should be more transparent. I think you can make assumptions that, should I not send it back for $1 more? And even if I might save $5,000 to do that, but what is it? Is it worth what the hotel has to go through? And could I communicate in the very beginning, and I think some buyers actually do this where they say, I'm only going 2 rounds. And I expect that you give me the best in those 2 rounds, because they know there's a diminishing ROI the more they keep going on both sides, right?
I think that's another really good point. I also see just a lot of value in being able to express your total program outcome, and measurable objectives. Some of it you keep internal, but I think a lot of it could be shared externally, so that the people on the hotel side, trying to come up with the best offer, they can provide the appropriate offer, and maybe also in the future that would be helpful for some of the tasks that are provided with AI powered assistance or automation. It would be interesting to just have those like really powerful full program kind of outcome metrics, and in terms of rates and amenities, I think we've maybe figured that out, but some of the maybe less tangible, less maybe more difficult to measure, like sustainability. How much do you value sustainability? Maybe the industry could come up with some kind of a industry-wide index for sustainability, as they have for star rating, for example, and the buyer side could express their values. So in some cases, you could lower the rate by $2, but it's not as important as some of your other amenities.
Well, the missing metric in the equation is volume, right? And the thing is, if you're talking about a high volume hotel, then those $2 or $3 do start to add up and make a big difference. If it's a low volume hotel, then it comes down to the way that the buyer is evaluating their performance, right? One of the metrics I know that buyers look at is I started at X and I finished at Y. And so even if there's no volume or there never will be volume or there's not much volume, they still get a benefit if they go from $100 to call it $90 as opposed to from $100 to $95. And so if a buyer is trying to juice the negotiation prowess metric, then all of a sudden the rounds start to go up, no matter what the volume is.
Right. And some buyers are measured on that start to
That's right.
finish. And then, circling back around at the end of the year to put a volume number against that, right? Especially buyers in the procurement sector, for sure. I would see that quite a bit. Yeah, I mean, it's data drives everything we're talking about. And it can be overwhelming because there are so many data points. But you both have given some really good insight into just rethinking what matters. None of us on this call know what is going to matter to a customer, a buyer, the most. It's just asking that question themselves, and then looking at that through that lens. Because also, I believe if you really refine what you're trying to measure, you actually can speed it up. You actually might even get better rates. So that's for another discussion, but I do think there's some of that as well. Okay, so our final topic is what's next. So I kind of teased that in the beginning. Let's take a look back and have some observations. But we're always trying to, on the Accommodations Committee, think about what can we bring out into the community, the GBTA community, about what's next. So Fred, I'll ask you, if you had to sum it up, what's next beyond the RFP?
What's next beyond the sourcing, or
yeah, just if you think about, is it technology's role? Is it a supplier role? What do you think is going to just happen in this space? Maybe is it better data? Is any of those kinds of things?
Yeah, because I was going to mention, obviously, like beyond, let's say, the next few years, one of the big changes will be we will be adopting the new catalog of questions, obviously, from GBTA. So I think that's going to be really important because, the current GBTA format has already created, huge efficiencies, obviously, to have suppliers and buyers and providers align on most important questions, and that needs to be updated. So I think that will be huge. And obviously, as tech providers, we know that the AI-related enhancements, capabilities, and automation is probably going to be increasingly important, and we'll need to figure out how to, allow these kinds of capabilities for both buyers and suppliers to adopt them comfortably, make sure that they're still in control and they feel comfortable getting assistance for some of the AI-powered systems, but also like maybe automating some of the tasks that are repetitive, and not as important for maintaining relationships.
Mm-hmm. And there will be a session on that at GBTA. So check out the education sessions online for convention and look that up, because there will be some more discussions around the new catalog and what that means for buyers. David, what do you think? What are your thoughts?
I think there's two trend lines that we're watching. One trend line is the automation, and I think Fred touched on that with AI. Having done this manually, and if you're looking at a conversation between, well, I used to pay $150, they're coming at me at $200, but they're going to give me free breakfast, those things carry value if you can figure out how much the breakfast is and how much volume you have for that market, right? But if you're doing this across hundreds of hotels in a very compressed time period, as everybody always is, how do you answer that question quickly, right? And this is where I think AI will certainly, play a role. They can tell you that breakfast at this hotel costs this much money, and if you marry that to your expense data, you can see how often people expense breakfast versus going for the free breakfast, right? And it'll be less about narratives, like, oh, in Europe they love their free breakfast, but in Seattle, Washington, not so much. AI is going to help the buyer make some of those decisions. Keep in mind, AI is probably also going to help the supplier make some of those decisions too. So we may have a point where one agent is talking to another agent at one point, right? But the other trend line that I'm concerned about, and we are going to talk about this at GBTA as well from the Accommodations Committee, which is how much of that production that is coming into a hotel is attached to the corporation, right? And in a world where there's multi-sourcing, in a world where there's supplier marketplaces and other OTA content that's being mixed in with the corporate negotiated content, that becomes an issue. And so if a hotel is looking at a world with 5 room nights and a buyer is looking at the same hotel with 1,000 room nights, it's going to be hard to have a honest negotiation with each other when one doesn't know what the other actually is looking at. And so I think, that's an interesting trend to watch. We're going to explore it on the Accommodations Committee. It's a debate that we like to have pretty much every time we're on the phone. But I think that's going to be, where a lot of to answer the question, what's next, we got to figure out what that's going to do.
Yeah, I agree. It's a great segue into our final question. And I've got some stats up on the screen because actually our committee put out this survey just this week from the LinkedIn community of what they think will be the most disruptive by 2030. Clearly AI. But what was interesting about this, the way the question was phrased was AI replacing the RFP. I think we all are of the mindset, and hearing the two of you, that it's a complement to it and make it, faster, smarter, all of that. But yeah, that's a high percentage of people who think it'll actually replace it. And dynamic, certainly, like we said, that's going to continue to be a topic. So, Fred, I'm going to ask you, let's fast forward. We're sitting here in 2030. What is the biggest change we're going to be talking about?
I think related to this poll, I would expect that there will be some of the jobs that some kind of a progression of jobs or tasks that is either being assisted or automated, and it will depend on the comfort level of the industry. And so we'll have to make sure that we make these easy to adopt and reliable, consistent in terms of results. And I think, to your point, something that will help with that, even, with the people supporting the process, but also some of these AI systems, it will be really even more helpful to be able to express those preferences and the values across the different attributes. And like I said, I think we've probably done pretty well on some of the key ones, the rates and amenities, and even, policies and star ratings in terms of traveler experience, although I think we can improve there. But some of the other categories, like I know, especially in EMEA, sustainability is becoming increasingly important. But how can we kind of index that value as an industry, and so that the travel managers can be able to show that value to their corporation, which is saying this is important for us. But also, the hotel side can have visibility into those values and be able to respond appropriately. And that impacts, during solicitation, initial bid response, negotiations, post sourcing and bookings. So I think the industry would, improve if we kind of can adopt this kind of tech and data.
And I think we will. If I have my crystal ball, I think we will. Right. David, what do you think? What will we be talking about as the biggest change in 2030?
I think in 2030, we'll probably be thinking a lot about just work differently. I mean, we're talking about corporate travel sourcing primarily, right? But what drives the conversation to have a corporate travel sourcing conversation is corporate travel itself, right? And so now you're starting to think about what's the next generation travel appetite, Usually it gets bigger and bigger from generation to generation. I don't know that it necessarily will in the next generation. There's a lot going on in the world. People aren't necessarily going to want to go out there as much as they can. I think, again, travel is certainly the best way for business to get done, because when you're face to face, even if you have to go across the world to go have that, half day meeting or 2 day meeting, it's much more impactful than it is to do it over a video call. But 2030, well, I guess 2030 is a lot closer than I thought it was. What's that going to look like? Is that going to change? And as a result of that changing, what will the landscape look like for corporate travel in terms of how it's fulfilled? Are there going to be new technologies in booking tools? Are there going to be new technologies in the way people book travel, right? And what's the impact of that on the decisions they make as it relates to whether to go to this hotel or that hotel? I think another thing that I would be looking for is, what is the impact of loyalty? Loyalty is what drives a lot of these decisions, right? And does the next generation of travelers care about that as much as the last generation does? So, I think answering those questions will help inform what we'll be doing as it relates to sourcing hotel rooms at that point.
That's a really good point. You both bring up things that are exciting to think about happening in 2030, but this ecosystem of hotels and hotel sourcing is so delicate. There's so many things on the outside that can impact what we're all talking about today. And then you add in the layer of adapting to those changes. So it will be really, I'm sure we're all going to be around in 2030 and talking about this as well, but it will be really interesting to see where we're at. But I agree, AI, and then the data that powers AI is really going to be front and center, because AI can't work without good data. I mean, I think it's limitless. I think there's so many things that it could complement, but you have to have good data, right, to start that. So thank you both for bringing us into the future. So let's close things out. So first of all, want to thank you for listening. This is The Business of Travel. This is the official podcast of the Global Business Travel Association. We'd love for you to learn more about us. There is a QR code here on the screen you can scan. This will take you to the hub, and you can learn more about our committee. We're excited to hopefully see you all in Chicago. But until then, thank you for listening and take care.